Hollywood is built on legends. The A-list superstars, the billion-dollar franchises, the faces that never fade from the spotlight. But beneath the glitz and glamour, there's another Hollywood, a world of underground icons. They weren't winning Oscars, they weren't starring in billion-dollar blockbusters. But in the world of VHS tapes and late-night cable marathons, they were kings and queens. If you walked into a video rental store in the 80s or 90s, you saw their faces on every shelf. They weren't mainstream, they weren't critically acclaimed, but to an entire generation of movie lovers, they were unforgettable. And then, they vanished. Hollywood moved on. The VHS era died. The industry that once thrived on their movies discarded them. Some tried to reinvent themselves. Others disappeared entirely. A few kept fighting to stay relevant. But the truth is, Hollywood rarely gives second chances to B-movie stars. So what really happened to them? Why does Hollywood treat its cult icons like disposable relics? And more importantly, I assume, do they deserve a comeback? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. Unlike many on this list, Bruce Campbell never fully disappeared. His role as Ash Williams in The Evil Dead made him one of the most beloved cult classic actors of all time. Charismatic, witty, instantly recognizable. Bruce Campbell should have been huge, but despite his dedicated fan base, Hollywood never gave him a real chance at mainstream success. Yes, he had small roles in major films, but a leading role in a blockbuster franchise never happened. Maybe it was his association with campy horror. Maybe Hollywood didn't know what to do with his larger-than-life presence. Either way, Campbell became the king of B-side cinema, forever loved by fans but never fully embraced by Hollywood. Cynthia Rothrock was primed to be the female Van Damme, and she had the skills to back it up. Throughout the 80s and 90s, she dominated the straight-to-video martial arts world, delivering high-energy fights and executing her own stunts with precision. Unlike many action stars, Rothrock wasn't just acting. She was a 5-time world karate champion, bringing real combat expertise to the screen. So why didn't she ever get a big-budget Hollywood breakthrough? Simply put, the studios didn't take martial arts films seriously unless they had a big-name male lead. While Rothrock was headlining movies internationally, Hollywood kept banking on stars like Van Damme, Seagal, and Stallone for its action blockbusters. By the time female-led action films started gaining traction, Rothrock's prime years had passed, and Hollywood had already moved on. Her talent was undeniable, but the industry never gave her the platform she deserved. Bai Ling had everything to become a Hollywood femme fatale. A striking presence, a unique screen charisma, scene-stealing performances in films like The Crow and Red Corner. But Hollywood never fully embraced her. Why? Maybe it was her outspoken personality which made her unpredictable in a system that favors safe choices. Whatever the reason, Bai Ling found herself sidelined, relegated to SM. In the mid-80s, action movies were everything. And for a brief moment, Michael Dudikoff looked like the next big action hero. His breakout role in American Ninja, 1985, turned him into an overnight sensation, especially in the world of home video where martial arts movies were gold. For a while, he was everywhere. Sequels, knockoffs, straight-to-video action films that played on endless loops in video stores and late-night cable TV. But there was one problem. Dudikoff wasn't a trained martial artist. Unlike Jean-Claude Van Damme or Chuck Norris, who had real fighting backgrounds, Dudikoff had to learn on the job. And as Hollywood began favoring authentic martial arts stars like Jet Li and Jackie Chan, his appeal started to fade. By the late 90s, his leading roles disappeared. Hollywood moved on. Today, he's remembered as a cult action icon, but never got the second chance that some of his contemporaries did. In the 80s, Adrienne Barbeau was horror royalty. She starred in The Fog, Escape from New York, and Creepshow, films that defined an era. She had a distinct presence, a smoky voice, a tough, no-nonsense attitude that made her unforgettable. But by the 90s, Hollywood moved on. Younger scream queens took her place, the roles stopped coming. She transitioned into voice acting and smaller TV roles, but never reclaimed the leading lady status she once had. Despite this, her films became classics, proving that even when Hollywood forgets, horror fans never do. Not every forgotten star was abandoned by Hollywood. Some walked away. Phoebe Cates was the definition of an 80s icon. From Fast Times at Ridgemont High to Gremlins, she had the perfect mix of charm and screen presence. She could have had a long Hollywood career, but in the 90s, she made a choice. She left acting behind to focus on her family. She married Kevin Kline, raised their children, and never looked back. Today, she owns a boutique in New York, living a completely different life from her Hollywood peers. Thom Mathews should have been the Bruce Campbell of his generation. He starred in two of the most beloved cult horror films of the 80s, The Return of the Living Dead, 1985. As Freddy, the unlucky punk who accidentally unleashes a gas that turns corpses into brain-hungry zombies. Friday the 13th, Part 6. Jason Lives. As Tommy Jarvis, one of the best protagonists in the entire franchise. He had the look, the charisma, the fan base. So why didn't he become a bigger star? Because Hollywood never gave him a shot outside of horror. By the early 90s, roles dried up. He stepped away from acting and started a career in construction. Today, horror fans still celebrate him at conventions, but mainstream Hollywood, they forgot his name. In the 1980s, horror movies weren't just a genre, they were a phenomenon. And if you were a horror fan back then, you knew Linnea Quigley. She wasn't just in horror films, she defined them. Her role in The Return of the Living Dead, 1985, made her an instant icon. Her punk rock look, fearless performance, and unforgettable cemetery dance cemented her status as a horror legend. She became a staple of B-movie horror, starring in films like Silent Night, Deadly Night, 1984, a holiday horror classic where she meets a brutal fate at the hands of a killer Santa, Night of the Demons, one of the most infamous B-horror films of the decade, Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bowl-O-Rama, 1988, a perfect example of 80s B-movie insanity. Linnea was everywhere in the horror scene. She wasn't just another Scream Queen, she was the Scream Queen. But when the 90s rolled around, Hollywood changed. Big-budget horror franchises took over, and the kind of low-budget, practical effects-driven horror that made Linnea a star started to disappear. Hollywood didn't just forget about her, it replaced her. Newer Scream Queens stepped into the spotlight, and Linnea's signature brand of over-the-top, grindhouse-style horror was no longer what studios were looking for. She continued working in indie horror, appearing at fan conventions and keeping her cult status alive. But despite her legendary status among horror fans, Hollywood never gave her the recognition she truly deserved. Linnea Quigley should have been celebrated as a pioneer of the genre. Instead, she became another name on Hollywood's long list of forgotten stars. But if one thing is certain, horror fans never forget. And for those who grew up on 80s horror, Linnea Quigley will always be the queen of screams. If you watch low-budget horror in the 80s, you definitely saw Michelle Bauer. She was part of the trinity of Scream Queens alongside Linnea Quigley and Brinky Stevens, starring in some of the most insane horror films of the decade. Her most famous roles include Hollywood Chainsaw Hookers, 1988. Just from the title, you know this is peak 80s trash cinema. Michelle was the perfect blend of camp, comedy, and classic horror energy. She knew exactly what kind of movies she was in, and she owned them. But like so many Scream Queens, when the horror landscape changed in the 90s, Hollywood discarded her. Instead of getting mainstream roles, she was relegated to erotic thrillers and ultra-low-budget productions. Despite this, horror fans never forgot her, and she remains an underground legend. If you're a fan of trashy, over-the-top horror comedies, then you definitely remember Patty Mullen. She wasn't just another Scream Queen, she was the unforgettable face of Frankenhooker. But unlike other B-movies actresses who kept working in the B-movie scene, Patty Mullen completely disappeared from Hollywood. So what happened? Patty Mullen started her career as a Penthouse Pet of the Year in 1988, using her striking looks and natural charisma to transition into acting. Her breakout role came in Doom Asylum, 1987, a low-budget, ultra-gory slasher film that became a cult classic for its absurd deaths, cheesy dialogue, and so bad it's good charm. But her true legacy was sealed with Frankenhooker, 1990, a horror comedy masterpiece directed by Frank Henenlotter, the same mind behind Basket Case, 1982, and Brain Damage, 1988. In Frankenhooker, her iconic character Elizabeth, a woman brought back to life by her obsessed boyfriend. Only this time, she's reanimated using the body parts of New York prostitutes. The result? A purple-lipped, short-circuiting, man-killing zombie hooker who spouts lines like "wanna date," while electrocuting unlucky customers. It was trashy, it was absurd, it was pure cult horror perfection. Patty's performance was flawless, blending comedy, horror, and over-the-top physical acting in a way that made Frankenhooker one of the most iconic B-movies of all time. Even horror legends like Bill Murray reportedly loved it. She had the talent and the screen presence to continue in the cult horror world, maybe even transition into bigger movies, but instead, she vanished. After Frankenhooker, Patty never acted in another film again. Unlike other Scream Queens who built long careers in horror and exploitation cinema, she simply walked away from Hollywood. There was no high-profile scandal, no failed career downturn, she just left. Over the years, she has made rare convention appearances, meeting fans who still adore Frankenhooker, but she never pursued acting again. Why? No one knows for sure. Would you like to see Patty Mullen return to horror? Let us know in the comments, and if you love deep dives into Hollywood's forgotten legends, hit that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.